Hello, everyone that's joining. We're just going to wait 1 or 2 minutes more for everyone to join, and then we'll get going. Excellent. I think we can get started. Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Emily Hickson. I am a director at Climate Catalyst over our aviation program and also our business and investor work. And today I have the pleasure of sharing with all of you some of what we've learned in the last 8 months in our aviation program, as well as some of the research we've commissioned, which Tim Harrison-Byrne, co-managing director of NFP Research, who conducted the research, will be presenting later on in this webinar. So just a note on who Climate Catalyst is, if you don't know us. So we're a relatively new NGO. We focus on complex challenges where collaboration has great potential to unlock action. And we work on two industrial decarbonisation topics, one on steel, and primarily that work is in India, and one on aviation, where, of course, we're focusing in on today. So in our aviation work, we actually do three things. We work on key policy measures in the UK and the EU, where we think there's scope to unlock greater ambition on sustainable aviation fuels, high integrity ones, we'll talk more about that later, zero emission flight technologies and demand management. And we also do work on testing and crafting compelling narratives to urge change. And we influence the business and investor community, which is what we're sharing about today. So this webinar is aimed for our NGO partners. It's crafted for them, who have told us a deep dive into the role of the investor community in aviation and the risks and the opportunities that they're facing would be really helpful. So the information that Nick and I will present will hopefully provide some of that overview. And we'll also provide lots of context, because many of you have told us in the pre-webinar survey that you have little to no knowledge of the role in the investor community to date. So I'll be providing lots of context. And it's worth saying that we'll be focusing in on finance in the round, so both kind of investors from the equity point of view and also lenders from the debt point of view. So really a focus on the role that finance is playing in tackling aviation emissions. So if we go to the next slide. So this is our agenda. So I'll just present for the next kind of 15 minutes or so on what we've learned as Climate Catalyst, focusing in on this topic, why investor action is needed. Hopefully that will be relatively obvious once I get through the state of play of where we are on aviation decarbonisation. And then really, I think what a lot of you were interested in hearing about, which is what we have learned on the different roles of different financial actors in the aviation challenge. And then I'll be just giving an overview of some of those challenges and risks that are coming up in this community before handing over to NFP to tell us from the horse's mouth what they've heard from the investment community. And then we will have a big chunk of time for Q&A at the end. So if we go to the next slide. So what I'm about to do is just give a quick overview of the kind of why investor action is needed for a lot of you whose day-to-day roles on aviation. This will be very familiar territory. If we just go to the next slide. So just to place this in context, as we know, the transport sector is falling really well behind its kind of parallel sectors when it comes to emissions reductions as demand continues to grow. And so you can see that blue line is the kind of projection of emissions kind of going up and well above the line that we would need to stay on a net zero trajectory. And aviation is a big part of that. So aviation emissions are going up in line with kind of global demand for aviation. And so even even as aviation's kind of intensity of emissions in some places can reduce, the overall demand globally is going up as more people take flights across India, China, but also in Europe, demand is going up, leading to that rise in emissions. So clearly a lot of work is needed to be done to address the challenge. On this slide, this is one of a variety of kind of representations of some of the solutions and mechanisms that are needed in order to tackle those emissions. I'm sure many of you have seen multiple net zero pathways that also reference some of the same technologies and measures that are referenced in this graph. So it's clear on a net zero pathway that efficiency and indeed demand management is going to be necessary. And each of the net zero pathways published by IEA, IETA, Mission Possible, and this one here from T&E shows a role for efficiency, but also a big role for sustainable aviation fuels and zero emission technologies, especially the latter technologies as we move towards 2050. So each of these measures is going to need to come some way, and each of these measures is going to really need some investment. So if we go to the next slide. Of course, we now have in the EU and the UK mandates around sustainable aviation fuels, which put in place really the targets that should be met. But if we look at this graph, which is in the context of the mandates, the graph shows that the announced supply is not on track to meet the mandates based on projected demand in 2030. So if you see this kind of pale grey area in 2030 outstrips the projected supply that's been announced by providers, by SAF kind of producers today. And really, if you were even to dig further into that data, so this graph is demonstrating that a lot of the projected SAF supply, sustainable aviation fuel, sorry to spell that out, is actually from waste kind of oils and fats, which is not the highest integrity sustainable aviation fuel, but it is the fuel that's on the market today. But it's clear from the net zero pathways that as we move towards 2030 and beyond, we're going to need an increasing amount of fuels based from high integrity feedstocks. So feedstocks like renewable electricity, so an e-fuel, which is represented by this yellow bar, in order to get on a kind of emissions reduction pathway. And even then, those fuels don't help us reach zero. That's only zero emission technologies. So this graph really represents that even with the projected supply, we are not on course to meet the mandates. And we could have shown other figures. So for example, transport and environment, you may be familiar with their e-fuels mapping from Europe, which shows that 51 e-fuel companies are setting up and announcing that, the types of supply that figures that they might be able to reach, but none of them are reaching final investment decision. We'll get into what that means in a minute. But that's really concerning if we think that the amount of fuel that needs to enter the market by 2030 is being held up because of lack of investment in these companies. So it's clear that more investment is needed and supply is not on track. So if we just go to the next slide. So saying that, so it's clear more investment is needed and we're not on track. Governments have been responding to this. So firstly, as aforementioned, through the introduction of the mandates. So in the UK, where I am today, there's a 10% SAF mandate by 2030. But also governments are understanding that that's not necessarily the only thing that is needed to move this market. And right now I'm going to be talking about SAF, but some of these policies are related to other aviation decarbonisation technologies like zero emission flight technologies. So really the point of this slide, and I won't go through every policy, is to demonstrate that governments have been putting some of their money where their mouth is in terms of applying public funding to the scale up of some of these aviation decarbonisation technologies. So I'm sure people are familiar with the idea that the IRA is providing a lot of money, both in tax credits and also in kind of indirect grants into the sustainable aviation fuel sector, but also sometimes the EU is mischaracterized as only supplying sticks and not carrots, but a huge amount of funding is also available through various different pots in the EU and various different kind of legislation pots of money. And the UK has also announced that it will introduce a revenue certainty mechanism. So this is really to demonstrate that there's quite a lot of public funding going into this sector. The industry will always demand more, but government has stepped up where they've seen industry really be quite lacking. And if you're interested in public funding, we have a public funding database on the Climate Catalyst website. So you can find that on our aviation page on our website, and you can filter by country and kind of public funding pot. So it really demonstrates the range of funding that's available to both kind of startups, the R&D process, but also a little bit further along the investment chain. And again, we'll look at that slightly more in a minute. So if we just go to the next slide, this is really just to demonstrate that, and it's from a report from ICCT, the types of government funding that is that will be necessary to achieve aviation decarbonisation. So ICCT predicts that aviation decarbonisation globally will cost around $5 trillion in tech investments by 2050, and that 20% of that money will come from government, leaving 80% of that money to come from industry and the private financial markets. So we can see here that there's a variety of different ways that governments are giving public funding through grants, through market subsidies along the value chain. But really, industry will need to be paying the bulk of that money as we move through towards 2050. So if you go to the next slide. So who are these financial actors that will need to be investing in decarbonising aviation? Headline, there's a variety of them, and I'm going to move through them relatively quickly, but I can take questions of them at the end. And here we'll have a kind of primary focus on sustainable aviation fuel and zero emission flight investments in this space, because that's what we've explored the most. It's also just worth noting, just before I go through this, that although we're focusing primarily on investment today, there are other sources of influence that the financial community has. So firstly, of course, through advocacy, and there are various different investor coalitions that are working on aviation decarbonisation and are influencing policy, but also through their kind of stewardship of companies in their portfolios and also through their voting. So there's a variety of ways that the investment community can have influence, or the financial community can have influence on aviation decarbonisation, not just through the amount of money that it either lends or invests. If we firstly move to venture capital, so just to provide a bit of context, as I said, some people coming to this webinar said that they would like this kind of additional kind of 101 on what these actors are. There was not enough time to go through that in real detail, but I think, you know, at a very high level, venture capital provides money usually in the early stage of a company's development. So in that very early stage where commercial viability is quite a long way off, and therefore they're characterized as being high-risk investors, but also demanding usually quite a high return through strict terms and through usually acquiring quite a lot of equity relative to the size of the company at that stage. Obviously that varies, but that's a characterization. But these actors have been very active in the aviation decarbonisation space to date, because it is still quite nascent and full of lots of startups, even though of course the aviation is full of quite incumbents, including the airlines and the oil and gas industry that we'll talk about in a second. But when it comes to zero emission flight technologies and also sustainable aviation fuel, those industries at the moment tend to be dominated by smaller, newer companies. So just to go to the next slide, just to give you a snapshot. So here and this is from dealroom.com. So this is a kind of a tracking site of deals that have happened in the climate tech space. You can see the kind of high level overview of what VCs have been investing in over the last 8 years. And I thought this was very interesting to show that although there's quite a chunk of money going into the zero emission flight technologies, if you dig deeper in this, and I've seen this in other sources, a lot of money is actually flowing into small electric planes. And although that is, of course, necessary to like test, you could argue anyway that it's necessary to test these technologies in small planes before they kind of reach the commercial aviation sector, which is what we really need to decarbonise. In a sense, it could be quite worrying that the bulk of money is going, or a sizable amount of VC money, venture capital money, is going into what you could characterize as the taxis, flying taxis of the future. So this is really an area to watch, because of course we want VC money to flow into the areas that is going to have the highest bang for buck on emissions reductions in aviation decarbonisation. If we just go to the next slide, this just shows some of the volumes of venture capital funding that's been going into the aviation sector, into startups, as I say, so small companies. And although here, I think you can see that there was a real peak in 2022, which actually really trends in climate tech in general. So you could show this slide for other sectors and it would be probably very similar. It is good to see that the level of funding, kind of the ticket size, is increasing. So the amount of monies that is being invested in different companies is kind of getting more mature, but the overall total is less. And just a quick note on who are these venture capital companies, because this is a question we asked ourselves at the beginning of our work. And we started to look particularly into e-fuel companies. And, you know, without going into too much detail, I'd say a range of different venture capital firms are investing, from kind of mission-driven climate impact VCs to what is called maybe a strategic VC, which means that a kind of company that's in the supply chain of this, so maybe an electricity company, but also oil and gas company venture capital arms are investing in the e-fuel industry and in SAF industry at large, but not necessarily further up the chain. So that's just a bit of a snapshot on activity in venture capital. If we go to the next slide, and sorry, there's not a lot. I'm just going to go through a variety of the actors that are influential and influential financial actors on aviation decarbonisation. Some I'm going to speed through, and some I'll spend more time on, and we can always dive into them in the questions. But multilateral development banks are quite significant players when it comes to scaling new technologies, and we've seen that notably with renewables across the world. So they are on paper an important player. We haven't seen that much action to date, but they could be important given the risk profile of sustainable aviation fuel and zero emission technologies for flight. Their ability to invest for the long term, their ability to provide technical assistance will be necessary to help sustainable aviation fuel industries set up in developing countries, and obviously set up in a responsible way with the highest integrity feedstocks, which are scalable and sustainable, which we would advocate for as climate catalyst. So there is some work being done in Egypt by the EBRD on feasibility of SAF industries. So this is the role that we think they'll play in kind of in emerging markets, and helping kind of companies and industries kind of build from a very low base. So if you go to the next slide, investment funds and asset managers are a critical but still quite nascent part of the capital stack. So we're finding fewer examples of investment from them. And this is probably primarily because the ask gets larger, i.e. the amount of money that these investment funds would typically want to invest is quite large, but then so is the amount of money that a commercial SAF plant, for example, would need to set up. So some plants would be needing up to 1 billion amount of capital to really reach commercial stage. So the risks at that amount of capital become very, very stark and are much more suitable to debt. So banks, lenders, loans. But we'll also get on to why that's look challenging. So there are a few examples of investment by asset managers, notably one from Macquarie into Sky and NRG, which is a sustainable aviation fuel company, one of the more mature ones that is using waste feedstocks, but potentially moving into third generation feedstocks. So we're seeing this work better for mature companies. Saying that, there's also example from Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, which kind of sits between VC and a major investment fund, I would say. They have helped fund Infinium e-fuels in the US, so quite a high risk technology in terms of at least in terms of pricing. We'll get on to that in a second. But the risk profile of that deal, from my reading, was really helped by the fact that Infinium had secured an off-taker, i.e. someone to buy the fuel in American Airlines, and also an environmental credit buyer in Citibank, which it uses to offset its own emissions. So I'm sure there's various views on this call on the integrity of using carbon credits in this way. But it's true when it comes to being able to craft a deal that a major investment firm would actually invest in, the credit buyer helping to offset the green premium is very, very helpful. And by that I mean, of course, this fuel is going to be much more expensive in the first instances than kerosene. So it's this ability to kind of reduce the price by selling the environmental attributes. We're seeing as a potential way that these fuel plants will get off the ground. We can talk about that maybe more in the questions. So moving on, and I'll only be another 5 minutes. So as I said earlier, really the scale of capital that's demanded to be able to commercialize a SAF plant, but also really to build the hydrogen and electric fuel planes of the future, really would traditionally come from a commercial bank through project finance. So this is, your typical way of investing in large-scale infrastructure at these types of sizes of capital investment needed. But at the moment, and we'll go through some of the risks, the banks are really saying to us when we've been speaking to them and in the literature that they've been putting out, that the risk profile is just too high of some of these technologies to date, which is not unusual for first-of-a-kind technologies. You'll see that in a variety of green technology, but does lead to that problem that I referenced earlier, that there's a lot of small companies who are having VC money, perhaps have achieved some private equity money, but are not able to reach commercial stage because they're not able to get the loans to build the plants that they need to build to get to kind of commercial stage and therefore actually produce revenue. So this is what really what's noted as the valley of death. We're seeing a lot of these companies not able to be able to get to this stage of the capital stack. Just quickly, as I'm going to just touch on 3 other financial entities that play a role in aviation decarbonisation. So next slide, please. So insurers can play a role in this industry, but also other green technology industries, by insuring a part of the production process, perhaps insuring against price increases of a feedstock, say renewable electricity prices, and therefore provide some confidence to lenders or indeed to equity, to institutional investors to make those investments. So insurers can kind of act to provide some confidence by insuring a part of the process. Go to the next slide. Lessors are a more unique financial actor, I'd say, to aviation. Not totally unique, but it is very, very notable that lessors actually own a lot of the aviation stock, i.e., they own a lot of the planes, these kind of financial actors called lessors. And so they could play a role in a variety of ways, both as a kind of customer of Boeing and Airbus by kind of using their influence to push for more efficient aircraft technologies, but also in their leasing arrangements with airlines. So when they lease a plane to a commercial airline, they could make the use of sustainable aviation fuel as part of that lease agreement. They could help their customers by aggregating the kind of purchase of sustainable aviation fuels. So there's a variety of roles they could play. And I think we're already seeing the beginning of kind of pressure on that. And then last slide on the actors, please. So I think we'll get to this in the Q&A because there's been a submitted question on this, but the role of oil and gas industry is an obvious elephant in the room if you're looking at how both SAF but also zero emission technologies can get off the ground. So it's obvious that BP, Shell, Total, Neste, these are the jet fuel producers of the present. And the question is, will they be the SAF producers of the future? Will they play a sizable role in the delivery of SAF in the future? These companies certainly have the balance sheets to be able to do much more when it comes to investing in SAF, and also things like e-fuels and potentially be providers of electricity to zero emission flight technologies. But we're seeing, I would say, a kind of muted response, and we can dig into reasons why for that. So just a couple more slides, and then I'll hand over to Tim to kind of tell us to tell us what some of these actors actually said themselves. Here, and we'll send these slides out later, but this I just put together kind of inspired by a similar grid that I saw from the CPI on steel. But if you can read this, this really just shows that as a technology kind of moves towards the right on here, so from research development to demonstration to commercial deployment, its sources of finance will change. And so that they will change through some of the actors that I've just gone through. So in the early stages, venture capital, towards the end, when commercial deployment is more ready, to more kind of debt, which is banks, as I said. And the risk profile changes as we move along. Obviously, as the technology develops, the risk profile generally reduces, and therefore the instrument type changes. So that's just really demonstrating how some of these actors fit together, and actually how they could be potentially working together more if we really wanted to help companies move through this kind of investment landscape towards commercialization. So final slide. So I'm going to, as I said, Tim's going to tell us from his research what investors have been telling him and what the financial community has been telling him. But I would say from what Climate Catalyst has learned to date, there are three main risk areas that are part of the investment challenge and that are kind of remain the barriers to greater investment, particularly in alternative fuels. But I think some of these would also be relevant to zero emission technologies. So they kind of fall into three buckets. Firstly, technology risk. Again, quite normal to first of a kind technologies, but there is risk that investors and the financial community would see from moving from what could be a pilot stage all the way up to scale up. You can just imagine how many things might go wrong in that process, and that's what investors will care about, having confidence that they're not going to go wrong. There's some risk around, as I said earlier, as you all know, lots of different feedstocks make up the bucket of sustainable aviation fuel, some much less sustainable and much less scalable, and investors will have an eye to that as well, which feedstock is kind of going to win the race, or potentially be made obsolescent. But really, I'd say the main bucket, and these interrelate, of risks falls around price risk. And frankly, that's about, as I've said repeatedly, the high costs involved in starting up any first of a kind technology, the long payback period, that investors will see, and then some of really the volatility of price, both as an input. So in SAF, that would be the feedstock, but also in the amount of money that the product can be sold for. And that's why offtake agreements with the airlines have been pretty important to deals being made. And lastly, the kind of green premium is what I pointed out earlier, the delta in the price between kerosene and these fuels, or the zero emission flights technologies of the future, is also something that investors are looking at, and something that policy has tried to kind of step in with the mandates and indeed the penalties associated with them. Finally, operational risks. I think I'll leave those there, but they're very as in very normal to first of a kind technologies, but they are really relevant to aviation, particularly kind of that feedstock sustainability point. So I hope that's been clear. I'm now going to hand over to Tim to tell us, what investors told him.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emily. And hello, everyone. So I work for NFP Research, and we are a research agency that works solely with not-for-profits across the UK, Ireland, and North America as well. So these slides that I'm going to share with you today come from a fuller report that will be shared later this week. So here are some of the top lines, if you like, from the research that we've done with investors. So we interviewed 17 investors in total. So these were venture capitalists, institutional investors. And then as part of this research, we kind of used a snowball sampling process where we asked for recommendations for people that we should speak to in this space. And as part of that, we spoke to 2 lawyers and an insurance broker as well, who provided a really interesting perspective, some of which backs up what Emily has said earlier. A lot were in the US, so 8 in the US, 4 in Europe, 2 in the UK, and then 1 each from Canada, Australia, and Southeast Asia. We've kept everybody anonymous for now for this webinar, and the research took place between mid-February and mid-May. As a kind of, to give you a sense of how hard we try to reach these investors, we contacted 124 firms. Often multiple people within each firm were contacted. So the response rate's about 5%, though not particularly high. We had to work quite hard to reach the 17 people that we did. But we've got some really interesting findings to take you through, and so we'll start now. The way we started the interviews with investors was asking them, well, what's your sense of where aviation is going to be in 2050? Will it be at net zero? And in short, the answer was pretty much no. There was very little optimism among investors that we'd be there. In part because there are these multiple pathways that Emily's alluded to. So will we kind of be using short haul electric planes? Will we have kind of hydrogen powered flight? SAF will certainly play a role, particularly in the short to medium term, but also carbon offsetting will be important. So it's like a range of different pathways. How are we going to get there? Which pathway will dominate and win over the others? But some kind of with the view that all the magic will happen from 2045 to 2050. Humans are good at emergencies, but we're not good at the long-term work, that kind of a view. But in general, not much belief that we'll be at net zero by 2050. So moving on then, today I'll be talking about the general perceptions of SAF and different types of SAF, and then we'll be getting into the kind of investment piece, the barriers to investment in particular, and then a little bit on mandates and a little bit on their perspective of NGOs and what role NGOs can play. Broadly, in terms of perceptions, the VCs that we spoke to, some of whom were already invested in SAF, it's important to say, had a pretty detailed understanding. And if we go on to the next slide, I think this quote sums it up quite a lot. And I should say that I'll be talking through quite a few quotes today. I've really kind of given you the voice of the investor directly, as opposed to me trying to sum it up for them. So people that are really into this space really do understand it. And there's a very deep understanding of the limitations and the cost implications as well. But it's a narrow set of players. These are very high-powered investors, very sophisticated ones that really do understand both the demand-side considerations as well as the supply-side cost. I think the real test will come when some of these go into the public market, which will need to happen in the next 1 to 3 years. It's going to be more challenging for the broader market to understand these solutions so that they don't get done on speculation but on the other hand, don't go into mad cycles of ups and downs as they're trying to really scale up. It really reflects the view of what we saw in this research. Venture capitalists were often in it or considering SAF. Some are very wary, but the institutional investors that we spoke to, some of those bigger investors, it's not for them at the moment. And this really reflects it, you know, going into the public markets, for example, the understanding not quite there. If we go into the next slide. So another venture capitalist from the US was reflecting on who's invested at the moment. And so he was saying for all the SAF startups that I've seen, I think probably 95% of them only have strategic investors versus financial investors. And I think that is indicative of at least the financial community just viewing this is a technology that is 5 or 10 years away from achieving scale. It's possible that they're investing not for financial motivations, but trying to get access to new technology for their existing businesses. So they don't see a financial return yet. And that's a crucial component of this for investors. They need to see that, but some are in that strategic space so that they're in an industry that could potentially benefit from the technology that some of these SAF producers are working on. On to the next slide. So we asked them about their understanding of the different types of SAF. So the e-fuels, power to liquid versus biosaf. I think broadly, most saw power to liquid as the best possible solution from a decarbonisation perspective. It can potentially have the highest reduction in total emissions, but it's crucial. It's really dependent. And if you just skip to, you can see at the end of this quote, it fundamentally needs very, very, very cheap hydrogen. And we haven't achieved that yet. They're predicting that might be reached by 2030 or beyond. So again, we're talking about some time in the future. The need for cheap hydrogen, cheap electricity, and renewable electricity, crucially, for the e-fuels. So that's one of the biggest risks with e-fuels. And then if we move on to biofuels, a number of investors are very aware of the potential limitations around biofuels. One institutional investor from Australia talking about, are biofuels really the best use of crops? Increasingly, we're thinking about food security and supply chains. There's quite a potential moral hazard or social license risk if we've got clients who are investing in biofuels and corn is being used to produce jet fuel when people are going hungry. So I think we have to be really careful about that element of it, and not just be careful, we need to understand it and make sure the risk is being priced, which I thought was like a classic investor perspective. That risk has to be priced, but also talking about the moral element of using biofuels. And then one venture capitalist that we spoke to in Indonesia was talking about Indonesia and Malaysia having a wealth of resources and in their part of the world, and whether or not palm oil can be used for SAFs as well. As you know, Malaysia and Indonesia makes up the top producers of palm oil globally. There are keen eyes to look at this area from an investment lens. So that, and investors also from different parts of the world kind of highlighted, okay, are we comfortable with this change in land use that could be happening? What are the potential elements of this? Are we going to be producing more carbon as a result of trying to, potential impact of deforestation, etc.? All of these were mentioned by some investors, but an interesting perspective there from Southeast Asia. So finally, there were different types of kind of investors who came to this from different perspectives. And on the next slide, there's one venture capitalist that we spoke to in Europe just saying, SAF is not where we should be focusing. So if you look at SAF in isolation, you always come to the conclusion that you should do it. But if you look at it in isolation, you ignore the rest of the picture. So you have to believe that there's going to be an abundance of electricity, and not just an abundance, but a massive supply in Europe. And that's really difficult to believe, because in short, we're not going to be able to produce all of that electricity to decarbonize heat, decarbonize industrial heat, residential heat, transportation. We probably need a tripling of power. And there are other sectors, and I think he referenced things like chemicals that are very resource intensive at the moment, that it would be better to focus on decarbonizing and using that additional electricity to decarbonize those rather than use it to produce jet fuel. So a range of perspectives there. Now, getting into the crux of this, investing in SAF. So as I said, some of the VCs that we spoke to were already invested in SAF and some of the big SAF producers. But the real barrier at the moment is, am I going to make a profit? That's really pretty much for all the investors that we spoke to. what's the return on investment here, and how long is it going to take for that return? So this first quote demonstrates that quite nicely. This institutional investor, so as I said, the institutionals that we spoke to, a little bit less knowledgeable about SAF, certainly than the VCs, but also a lot more risk averse, not yet convinced by SAF as an investment opportunity. I don't think it's appealing because I think the investors are only really worried about two things. One, how risky is it? And then how much money, if we invest in it, are we going to make? And that's their job. Their job isn't to fix the climate. Their job is to invest limited partner money and investor money in things that are going to actually make money. And that's the ultimate rub. Sustainability has to come into contact with capital every day in a whole bunch of different forms. And if you don't have alignment between the developer and the investor, there's no way these projects are going to be built. A lot of the investors that we spoke to were in the climate tech space, in infrastructure, transport. They were all interested in this. These were not investors who didn't really have a connection to it, which I think is also important to reference for this institutional investor who is potentially considering SAF. On to the next slide. Price is really important. SAF is currently more expensive than kerosene, quite a lot more expensive, particularly on the e-fuel side rather than the biofuel side. Every airline is going to sign up if it works and is cheaper. It's got to be cheaper than the existing solution. I think I've probably made the point with this quote. I don't probably need to read all of it. It's got to be cheaper for the airlines. And I'll talk about a little bit about airlines in a couple of slides' time. Next slide. So Emily already highlighted oil and gas and the role they could play in this. And for some of the investors, oil and gas is conspicuous in its absence in this sector. So as this venture capitalist said, I mean, oil and gas companies have a lot of money right now, right? They've been quite profitable in the last year or so. We talked to all of them and they're highly skeptical. They see the interest from the airlines, they see the policy from Europe, so they believe that, okay, maybe one day we'll have to get there, but not yet. You see Exxon, Schlumberger, Oxy, they're invested in carbon capture. That's where they're making their bets. They bought companies in the carbon capture and carbon sequestration space. Each of these companies in the past year or so made big purchases in that space. I think you'll see more of that. They're placing much smaller bets on SAFs so far. It could change. I think they struggle to see the economics of SAF just like we do. And these are the big oil and gas players. People reference them as having the experience of building big refineries. You know, some of the technologies that are going to be needed here are similar to how they currently produce oil and gas, and they have that expertise. They know how to do big deals, but they're not yet doing it in the SAF space. Next slide. Yeah, the insurance angle was really interesting on this. So we had a couple of institutional investors talk about insurance, and luckily we got to speak to a broker who was talking about how difficult it is for insurance companies to insure new technologies. So as they put it here, new infrastructure, new technology, it's not easy because there's no actuarial data behind it. Even when you've got your second factory of SAF, that second factory is still technically a new technology. So you're still not going to be able to insure it very easily. And I can understand the hesitation of a lot of investors without that insurance guarantee. There are more and more insurance products that are going to be developed to bridge that gap, technology insurances, but they demand a lot of research. That's where the brokers are doing a lot of the work to try and understand, to try and bring the insurers who ideally want as stable a business as possible. They want to bring them to the table and then to look, there might be a little bit more risk, but they're asking for a higher premium. You're still going to get a bunch of money off this. And this is all the analysis we've done. So they've got to do more analysis on these new technologies, but they'll charge more and will still get their cut. And then of the two lawyers that we spoke to, one was talking about the insurance market again and saying, look, even after 20 years of carbon finance, the carbon price, just in the last 12 months, we've had insurance specialists crop up in the carbon space. You've got companies that are providing specific tailored insurance products to incentivize buyers to invest in carbon projects. And that also needs to happen in SAF. We've had carbon finance for 20 years. I don't mean debt finance. I mean actual upfront investment by buyers. And it's taken 20 years for insurance products to become available. Give a sense of the timescale for what it takes for new areas, new technologies, for the insurance to get involved. Next slide, please. So finally, just some some comments on the airlines, surprising to us that actually, so the insurance broker was saying the creditworthiness of airlines is a major problem for lots of insurers. Every single SAF company is signing contracts with airlines, wonderful, but airlines are probably one of the least creditworthy companies in the world. I mean, they're cash poor, they have very little credit, and they carry massive amounts of debt. So anybody who has a contract with them is the last person getting paid if they go bankrupt. A view shared by a couple of investors, actually, and also some doubtful comments about offtake agreements about them, whether or not they have teeth, and there's been linked to this. And then one lawyer highlighting, yeah, the world's aircraft fleet is not actually owned by airlines, most of them, because again, on airlines, but it's owned by the lessors, and they're the ones who know how to structure deals, to structure investments. So these are the key people that we need to get on board. So next slide, please. Just a little bit on mandates. The mandates have had a really positive impact, and the incentives as well in the US. So again, from the lawyer, the mandates have had a huge help in demonstrating a requirement for SAF. And this bottom comment here, really interesting, about what is currently missing from really pushing the aviation space into decarbonising and doing more on climate action generally. There needs to be a contracting state that has agreed to comply with phase 1 of CORSIA. Somebody needs to implement a regulation that clarifies what the penalty for non-compliance is. So that was a really important legal perspective on phase 1 of CORSIA. And on mandates as well. So from somebody in the US who's very close to SAF, it's possible that it can be done through incentives alone. So talking about the IRA, but the incentives have to be strong. And I think realistically, the best case is that it's actually both, where you have incentives that go along with mandates. They've got reasonable incentives in the US, but they're not fully sufficient, especially with respect to duration. That was a really important point that he highlighted. But we have to have a mandate of some type, and maybe they could develop a US-centric kind of approach versus that one that the Europeans have laid out. And then the final section from me is just on the role of NGOs as kind of particularly relevant, I think, for this audience here. And there was one or two who are quite critical of the role that NGOs and the media play in terms of criticizing companies and airlines in this space for missing targets or for kind of attempting to do something. So this one was saying, look, it's stop bashing them and encourage them to do whatever they're doing, because all you're doing is making them back off. That's all that's happening. And we're going to miss all targets. Sorry, that's bleak, but it's the way it is. And so I asked kind of, well, why does the bashing put them off? Why does that kind of public criticism put them off? Because they don't want to be called out by The Guardian or whoever else. They don't want to be on the front page news. Why should they? Remember, a lot of this is voluntary action. There is no law. The reason why we have a voluntary market is because the law has failed. Public policy has failed. Governments have failed to put in place obligations on companies to actually decarbonize, right? So they take voluntary action and they make some mistakes, and that's okay. It's okay to make mistakes because they're learning. So I just wanted to kind of share that as one perspective. Another thing, you know, the classic, if you criticize investors, then we're just going to go to Luxembourg or Delaware or wherever it is that they want to go to. And then on the finally, kind of where are the gaps? So I think that a lot of the investors thought there's a job to be done by NGOs on influencing governments in this space. There's kind of work to be done there, but there's also maybe specific gaps around, say in the US with the IRA, say the IRA tax credit is this amount today, but we think actually that only actually scales SAF to 3 or 4% of the market. We need to double or triple it. So what's the level of incentive that's required? Or subsidy that's required to get SAF to a certain level, or what's the total tallying up of all the corporate soft commitments to purchase SAF? You know, what's the total level of demand from airlines currently for SAF, and seeing what that looks like is in addition to the kind of influencing piece that could be done by NGOs. So as I said, this is all part of a report that's going to be made available later this week. These were the key findings from it that I kind of whisked us through. And yeah, really, I won't go through these in detail now, but looking forward to the Q&A if anybody has any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. And yeah, as you say, we're going to make that available. Lots of interesting quotes in there, lots to agree with as well as disagree with on the future prospects of aviation decarbonisation. But really important to have it, yeah, kind of directly from the horse's mouth. So we've got a couple of questions coming in. So I think we'll start with some of the ones that we got in the chat, but we also had a few in the kind of pre-webinar survey that was submitted. So I'll just kind of go through them in order, and I think I'll have a go at some of them, Tim, but please just jump in as well. So firstly, there's one from Andrew that we managed to put in the answer column, but we did not answer it. But just on what carbon market City has used as part of their SAF plant transaction, the one that I mentioned with American Airlines and Infinium. So it's not publicly available information, Andrew. So actually, I don't have an answer to this. But as I said, I think we will see more of these deals going forward. So it's something that we as Climate Catalysts are interested in finding out more. So City, if you're hearing this, be in touch and let us know. Finley, you've got a great question here on kind of the kind of more systemic financial risks in SAF, particularly about investments in unscalable and unsustainable feedstocks leading to huge financial risk. Yes, I would agree with you. I think that was really kind of my point around obsolescence. But I think your point goes further than that. There could be financial risk in investing in unsustainable feedstocks, indeed feedstocks, biofuels, in areas where that land should be used for other means, comes to mind. So that's why we as Climate Catalysts have spent quite a lot of time trying to interrogate what would be the most scalable and sustainable fuels. And again, there's a lot of challenges in this area. As I mentioned earlier, our focus has been on e-fuels to date, so renewable electricity and CO2 input into those fuels, really not without its own challenges and financial risks, given the the availability and price of renewable electricity being one, but also the feedstock source of CO2, whether it's point source, where in the future it's direct air capture. So there are a variety of different financial risks, I think, associated with these sustainable aviation fuel feedstocks, but some are more likely to come to pass than others. So yeah, definitely, and definitely fuel stocks that are parading as one thing, but actually another. And we should really take care of those risks because that could lead to obviously investors being burnt and even less investment going into these areas. So that's part of our role to inform and educate investors on those risks. Great question here from Helen around really kind of, again, a kind of more system view of aviation here. So how can we be sure that the safety feasibility of aviation by 2050 is assured given climate uncertainty? We've obviously seen issues of air turbulence in the last couple of weeks, months, years, which leads us to think of the uncertainty of aviation industry in a climate changed world. I totally agree. I think the investors in Singapore Airlines will be looking at the compensation payments that Singapore Airlines is going to pay to all of those passengers on that flight. A couple of months ago now, where that gentleman unfortunately lost his life, and be really paying attention to the impacts, financial, but of course societal, of that. So that's definitely something to be factored in, and that is something that investors tell us themselves when we've been talking to them about, say, sustainable aviation fuel. They usually broaden the conversation to some of these more systemic risks. I'm just going to take one that was submitted to us earlier, and I don't know if Tim, you might have views on this as well, which is around the role of the oil and gas companies and why they're not doing more. I mean, I have a personal view on this, that really at the moment, particularly European oil and gas companies simply look at the risk profile and see that the margins that they could get in the future are not great enough to justify the initial investment. which is something that, you know, will change over time. I think they're also looking at the penalties that, so say under Refuel EU, that should come in, and they're not entirely clear of what, you know, what they'll be. I think the Commission has said that there'll be at least twice the price, the differential price between kerosene and SAF. But potentially they're thinking that the Commission might water that down, and indeed their lobbying might push towards that. So I would say they're very much in this wait and see moment. And yeah, Tim, I think some of that was reflected in what you heard.
Yeah, definitely. As one venture capitalist, he said they were recently at a conference, and some of these big investors from oil and gas were on stage reflecting on this, and they just don't see, it's all far too uncertain for them at the moment, and they just don't see it, the returns, and which I think is really influencing behavior of all other investors in this space. I think the next stage of capital that's required it's a really significant chunk, and because it's an unproven technology, it's a very big leap to take. And I think, you know, that's for oil and gas and for others. They're not quite convinced yet. And currently they see demand for aviation, demand for flying increasing, production of SAF not necessarily so. So in a way, it's inevitable that it's just going to be offsetting. It's probably what they see, and hence why they're going into carbon sequestration as their big investment piece, as that investor alluded to in my slides.
Tim, there's another question for you here, which from Matt, which says, did any investors come out and say outright that they would not invest in SAF because there are too many risks? Were any close to deciding that?
Yeah, I can probably go one better, which is that one investor had invested in one of the big SAF companies and then got out of it because they just didn't really see it anymore, and they were quite influential within one of those big SAF producers in the States. Again, there was a big conference on the West Coast, one big VC firm running it, and there's a quote in the full report which I took out of this one, which he said, I was there and there were probably 75 other tech investors in the space. Lots of them invested in SAF, and I think lots of them are regretting it now. Was perspective. This was a hot sector a couple of years ago, a year ago, and now it's kind of like that. Those difficulties around scaling are really apparent. So whilst there were some, I don't think this one, you know, came out. Others are in. I think they see there's a profit to be made, but it's years down the line. So they're really holding on for a long term, and it's part of a portfolio of investments that they have. Yeah.
Great. Thank you everyone for your questions. I think we are basically out of time, but what we'll do, I commit to you that we'll write back to you on our views on them. Some of them we don't claim to be the experts on, such as how sustainable will dairy products be as a feedstock stream, but we'll give it our go, and would love to continue the conversation. So just to conclude, so thank you everyone for attending. Keep an eye on your inboxes, as we'll be sharing the full research that Tim's just talked you through from NFP in the coming days. And I also want to kind of plug our learning network. So as part of our aviation communications learning network, we'll be hosting learning events and collaboration events, including skill sharing sessions, for NGOs and other actors to strengthen skills and knowledge across this kind of aviation decarbonisation space. So look out for our communications on those. If you're a civil society network or organisation that's not part of the network yet, do get in touch with me, and I can easily send you information about that. And as I said earlier, you can find out more information on our aviation work on our website, with lots of resources on different policy processes, on overview on SAF, and a lot of that is aimed at the investment community. So thank you for attending. Thanks to Tim for all the great work, and thank you to you for your questions, and look forward to speaking soon. Thanks everyone.
Thank you very much.